At the height of his fame, Joe Louis was one of the most famous men in America. Inside the ring, no one could touch him. Outside the ring, power worked very differently. One night in New York, Joe Louis was cornered by men who believed his fame meant nothing. Bumpy Johnson heard about it, and he did not ignore it. To understand why this moment mattered, the story must begin with how Harlem really worked. Joe Louis became the world heavyweight boxing champion in June of 1937. He was 23 years old. He knocked out James Braddock in the 8th round at Comiskey Park in Chicago. The fight made him the second black heavyweight champion in history. It also made him something much larger than a fighter. He became a symbol. To black Americans living under segregation, Joe Louis represented strength that could not be taken away. To white America, he was tolerated only because he won so cleanly and spoke so carefully. His fame was real, but it came with conditions. By the early 1940s, Joe Louis was making more money than almost any athlete in the country. He defended his title over and over. He became known as the Brown Bomber. He fought Max Schmeling twice. The second fight, in 1938, was watched by millions. It was treated as a fight between America and Nazi Germany. Joe Louis knocked Schmeling out in 2 minutes and 4 seconds. The victory made him a national hero, but that hero status did not protect him from the systems that controlled black life in America. Joe Louis traveled constantly. He fought in cities across the country. He trained in camps. He appeared at events. He gave interviews. He was famous, but he was also watched. His managers were white. His promoters were white. His contracts were controlled by white men. Joe Louis earned millions, but much of that money never reached him. He was taxed heavily. He was advised poorly. He was surrounded by people who saw him as an investment, not as a man. And when he came to New York, he entered a city where power was divided very clearly. New York in the 1940s was a city of borders. Harlem was black. Little Italy was Italian. The Lower East Side was Jewish. Midtown belonged to money. And organized crime controlled the places where those borders blurred. Nightclubs, boxing gyms, theaters, and after-hours joints were all part of a network. That network was run by men who did not appear in newspapers. They did not give interviews. They worked through enforcers, bagmen, and silent partners, and they expected compliance. The Italian mob controlled much of the nightlife in Manhattan. They owned clubs. They placed bets. They managed fighters. They decided who could perform, where they could perform, and what percentage they would keep. If a musician wanted to work in a major venue, the mob decided whether that would happen. If a boxer wanted a big fight, the mob had a say in the matchmaking. Joe Louis was too big to be controlled directly, but he was not too big to be pressured. In Harlem, the rules were different. Harlem had its own economy, its own nightlife, its own systems of enforcement. And at the center of that system was a man named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Most people called him Bumpy. He was not flashy. He did not wear expensive suits or drive loud cars. He was quiet. He was calculating. And he was feared. Bumpy Johnson was born in South Carolina in 1905. He moved to Harlem as a teenager. He grew up during Prohibition. He watched Italian and Jewish mobsters take control of the liquor trade. He watched them move into Harlem and set up operations in black neighborhoods. He worked for some of them. He learned from them. And eventually, he began to push back. By the 1940s, Bumpy Johnson was one of the most powerful men in Harlem. He controlled the numbers game, which was an illegal lottery that working-class people played daily. He also worked as an enforcer. He protected black-owned businesses. He mediated disputes. He made sure that Italian mobsters who tried to expand too far into Harlem understood the cost. Bumpy did not operate with open violence. He operated with presence, with reputation, and with precision. Bumpy Johnson cared deeply about the public figures who came through Harlem. He believed that musicians, athletes, and performers were important. They gave people pride. They gave people hope. And they were often vulnerable. Many of them did not understand how the city worked. They trusted the wrong people. They signed bad contracts. They drank too much or spent too much or trusted managers who stole from them. Bumpy watched over them, not out of sentiment. but because he understood that their safety reflected on Harlem itself. Joe Louis came to New York often. He trained at gyms in the city. He appeared at benefits. He attended fights. He went to nightclubs. And in the early 1940s, after defending his title multiple times, he was in New York during a period when tensions between different criminal factions were rising. The war in Europe was pulling attention and resources. Organized crime families were competing for control of wartime black markets. And Joe Louis, whether he knew it or not, had become a point of interest. The incident that would later become legend happened at a nightclub. The details vary depending on who tells the story, but the core facts are consistent. Joe Louis was at a club in Midtown Manhattan. It was late. He was there with friends, and at some point during the night, he was approached by men connected to an Italian crime family. These men were not low-level enforcers. They were made men. They were people with authority, and they had a message for Joe Louis. The message was about money. Joe Louis owed someone, or someone believed he owed them. It may have been a gambling debt. It may have been a dispute over an appearance fee. It may have been a shakedown disguised as a business conversation. Whatever the reason, Joe Louis was told that he needed to pay. He was told that his fame did not matter. He was told that if he did not settle the matter, there would be consequences. And the men delivering the message made it clear that they were not asking. Joe Louis did not respond the way they expected. He did not agree. He did not apologize. He did not offer to pay. He simply said no. This was a problem, because in the world these men operated in, no one said no, especially not a black man, especially not in a room where they controlled the exits. The situation became tense. The men did not leave. Joe Louis did not back down. His friends were nervous. The club staff noticed, and word began to spread. Within an hour, someone made a phone call. That phone call reached Harlem, and it reached Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson did not wait. He did not send someone else. He came himself. He arrived at the club with a small group of men. They did not announce themselves. They did not make a scene. They walked in quietly. Bumpy Johnson found the table where Joe Louis was sitting. He found the men who were pressuring him, and he sat down. What happened next was not a fight. It was not a shouting match. It was a conversation. But it was the kind of conversation where every word carried weight. Bumpy Johnson did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply made it clear that Joe Louis was under his protection. He made it clear that any attempt to collect from Joe Louis, to intimidate Joe Louis, or to harm Joe Louis would be considered a direct offense against him. And he made it clear that the consequences of that offense would be severe. The Italian mobsters understood what Bumpy was saying. They understood who he was. They understood what it meant for him to walk into that room. But they also had pride. They had reputations. They could not simply walk away without losing face. And that is when Bumpy Johnson reached into his coat and placed a straight razor on the table. The razor was not brandished. It was not waved. It was not used. Bumpy simply placed it on the table in front of him. The blade caught the light. The men at the table looked at it. They looked at Bumpy. And they understood. The razor was not a threat of immediate violence. It was a statement. It was a reminder that Bumpy Johnson did not make empty promises. It was a reminder that if this situation continued, it would end badly for everyone involved. And it was a reminder that Bumpy was willing to be the one who ended it. The Italian mobsters stood up. They did not apologize. They did not speak. They simply left. Joe Louis stayed. Bumpy Johnson stayed. And the tension that had filled the room dissolved. The incident was over. But the story was just beginning. Word of what happened spread quickly. In Harlem, people talked about it. In the Italian neighborhoods, people talked about it. In the boxing world, people talked about it. The story was not about violence. It was about control. Bumpy Johnson had walked into a room full of men who believed they had power, and he had shown them that their power had limits. He had done it without firing a gun. He had done it without throwing a punch. He had done it with presence, reputation, and a razor that never left the table. For Joe Louis, the incident changed how he moved through New York. He understood that his fame did not protect him the way he thought it did. He understood that there were people who saw him as a target, not as a hero. And he understood that Bumpy Johnson had stepped in when no one else would. Joe Louis never forgot that. He remained respectful toward Bumpy for the rest of his life. And whenever he came to Harlem, he made sure to pay his respects. For Bumpy Johnson, the incident reinforced his position. It showed that he was willing to stand up to the Italian mob on behalf of someone who mattered to the black community. It showed that he was not interested in starting wars, but that he would not allow Harlem's most visible figures to be humiliated or exploited. And it showed that he understood the value of symbols. Joe Louis was more than a boxer. He was a symbol of black pride. And protecting him was about more than one man. It was about protecting what he represented. The Italian mobsters who were involved did not retaliate. They understood that escalating the situation would be costly. They understood that Bumpy Johnson had allies. They understood that a war over Joe Louis would draw attention they did not want. And they understood that sometimes the smartest move was to let something go. The incident became a story, but it did not become a war. In the years that followed, Joe Louis continued to defend his title. He joined the army during World War II. He fought exhibition matches for troops. He became even more famous, but he also continued to struggle with money. His managers took too much. The government taxed him heavily. He made poor investments. By the time he retired, he was deeply in debt. He owed the Internal Revenue Service hundreds of thousands of dollars. He spent the rest of his life trying to pay it back. He worked as a greeter at a Las Vegas casino. He appeared at events. He signed autographs. He never regained the wealth he had earned in the ring, but he remained a symbol, and in Harlem, he remained protected. Bumpy Johnson continued to run his operations in Harlem until his death in 1968. He was never convicted of a major crime. He was never publicly connected to the incident with Joe Louis. But the story lived on. It was told in barbershops. It was told in bars. It was told by people who had been there and by people who had only heard about it. And over time, it became part of the mythology of Harlem. A story about the night that Bumpy Johnson walked into a room with a razor and reminded everyone that respect was not given by fame alone. It was earned, and it was enforced. The story of Joe Louis and Bumpy Johnson is not a story about heroes and villains. It is a story about power. Joe Louis had fame. He had talent. He had the admiration of millions. But in the world he lived in, that was not enough. He was still a black man in a segregated country. He was still subject to systems that saw him as a commodity. He was still vulnerable to men who believed they could take what they wanted, because no one would stop them. Bumpy Johnson understood that, and he stopped them. The razor that Bumpy placed on the table was never used. But it did not need to be. It was a message. It was a reminder that power is not just about strength or fame or money. It is about the willingness to act. It is about the ability to make people believe that you will follow through. And it is about knowing when to use violence and when to simply show that you could. What happened that night mattered because it revealed something about how the world worked. Joe Louis was one of the most famous athletes in history. He had fought for his country. He had represented America on the world stage. But when he needed protection, it did not come from the government. It did not come from the police. It did not come from his managers or promoters. It came from a man who operated outside the law, a man who understood that in Harlem, the law did not protect people like Joe Louis, and so he did. This was not unusual. Across black communities in America, informal systems of protection and enforcement existed because formal systems failed. Bumpy Johnson was part of that system. He was a criminal. He broke the law. He profited from illegal activity. But he also provided something that the legal system did not. He provided safety, he provided justice, and he provided respect. For people who had been denied all three by the country they lived in, that mattered. The incident also revealed the limits of mob power. The Italian crime families that controlled New York were powerful. They had politicians in their pockets. They had judges on their payroll. They had enforcers who could make people disappear. But they did not control Harlem. And when they tried to extend their reach too far, they were reminded of that. Bumpy Johnson was not more powerful than the Italian mob. But in Harlem, he had something they did not. He had legitimacy, he had loyalty, and he had the willingness to defend his territory. The story of that night has been told many times. Some versions are exaggerated. Some versions include dialogue that was never spoken. Some versions turn the razor into a weapon that was swung or threatened. But the truth is simpler and more powerful. Bumpy Johnson walked into a room. He sat down. He placed a razor on the table. And he made it clear that Joe Louis was not going to be pushed around. That was enough. Joe Louis died in 1981. He was 66 years old. He had been broke for most of his later life. He had health problems. He had struggled with addiction. He had been used by people who saw him as a way to make money. But he was still remembered as one of the greatest fighters who ever lived. And in Harlem, he was remembered as the man Bumpy Johnson protected. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. He collapsed while eating at a restaurant in Harlem. He was 62 years old. He never became famous outside of Harlem. He never wrote a book. He never gave interviews. But his reputation lived on. He became a legend. And the story of the night he walked into a nightclub with a razor became one of the defining stories of his life. The incident was never reported in newspapers. There was no police investigation. There were no arrests. It was handled the way most things in that world were handled, quietly, directly, and with an understanding that some disputes were better left unresolved by the law. For Joe Louis, it was a reminder that fame had limits. For Bumpy Johnson, it was another night of enforcing the rules that kept Harlem independent. And for everyone who heard the story afterward, it was a lesson in how power really worked. In the end, the story matters because it shows what life was like for Black Americans during segregation. Joe Louis could fill stadiums. He could inspire millions. He could knock out any man who stepped into the ring with him. But outside that ring, he was still subject to forces that did not care about his fame. He was still vulnerable. And he still needed protection. That protection did not come from the system. It came from a man who understood that the system would never protect people like him. A man who was willing to walk into a room full of dangerous men and remind them that respect was not optional. The razor on the table was never used, but it was remembered, and the message it sent was clear. Joe Louis was not alone, and anyone who thought they could intimidate him would have to deal with Bumpy Johnson first. That was the night Joe Louis learned that fame was not the same as safety. And it was the night Bumpy Johnson reminded everyone in New York that in Harlem the rules were different, and he was the one who enforced them.